Here we are with chapter 6. This will be the second large section in Unit 5 for the course. Chapter 6 brings us to the highlight of the course that we've been building up to, which is taking a look at modern humans right now, human variation, the sources of human variation that we see all around the planet, evolutionary factors, the fact that humans, like any other species, have to adapt, and the question of how adaptable are we still. Among these big ideas in the chapter, be sure that you take a look at some of these sections in specific. Firstly, right in the very beginning of the chapter, page 105 to 107, what is a population and its relationship to the term Deme? We did look at this previously, but it's there again in the chapter. Remember, Demes are your local breeding populations. It also has a little bit on the question of subspecies and biologically, what's the relationship between the vocabulary terms subspecies and race. Humans don't come biologically in races because we don't have any subspecies. So be sure you go slowly through those first chapters. The second section of the reading in the chapter, 108 to 112, doesn't really have vocabulary in it. You want to just go through it, jot down the ideas. It's about taking a look historically or in a non-scientific viewpoint about human populations and in a behavioral or cultural sense. So as you finish up with that, you'll be getting to about page 113, 114, and we will be looking at something more genetically significant and evolutionarily significant polymorphisms. And the big concept for the rest of the course is, what do we learn about humans today with the study of polymorphisms in modern populations? As you go through, they will also be addressing the question of, are humans still evolving? The answer is yes, otherwise it wouldn't even pop up in the course. But yes, of course, modern organisms are always evolving. If you remember all the way back to our second unit, every organism that is reproducing using gametes evolves in every generation. But what we want to know right now is, in what directions are we headed in the most recent future here? And then also towards the end, what has been the most dominant factor of human evolution in the last 10,000 years or so that we can take a look at? And this will link up what you're doing in chapter 6 with the study of epidemiology, which is presented in a slightly different section of Canvas here, and infectious disease. So let's go. Now, overview as we get started, thinking about human adaptations. Humans are, biologically speaking, an extremely generalized species, and that means that we can digest a huge amount or variety of foodstuffs, live in a big variety of environments. We're very able to travel, adjust, and survive when there are certain kinds of environments that are present on the planet. And just prior to this, you looked at origins and dispersal, and you see that humans started out along the belly area of the planet, right along the equator, in warm, dry, sunny climates, and have moved into shady areas, tropical areas, high altitude, Arctic Circle, island areas, and places with very, very comfortable versus not very comfortable environments. So, but it's only been in maybe about the last 40,000 years or so that we're seeing humans move into places that are very, very difficult for our species, such as the Arctic Circle, desert, and high altitude. You may be surprised to know, even though this isn't something we're going to look at a lot in this particular chapter, that of these three very challenging environments that are listed right here, that it is high altitude that is the most difficult for humans as a species. And that's because it's very high UV, very low rain, also very, very cold, and low O2 or oxygen concentration. All of those together mean it's very difficult for us to reproduce. So in other words, it's very difficult for women to conceive and then carry their pregnancies to term. And that is a giant reason why we don't have really high population at altitude over human existence up until today. Continuing with your exploration in the previous week and section for chapter 13 of different environments, humans dispersing into different environments over prolonged periods of time, like you looked at in the real leave selection, it should be really clear to you after the entire course that different environments are going to exert different selective pressures. Example might be less availability of protein in the diet. Another one might be more shade. Another one might be much colder environments or much further away from the equator where there's very, very low UV. So as an overall picture for your life science requirement here, you should be expecting that different populations within the same species are going to be differently adapted. We see this and recognize it easily socially for people today. We just don't necessarily see it so easily in our own species. For instance, when you're looking at photos of animals from the Arctic, such as rabbits or foxes or owls, or bears, we're not surprised at all when they come in very light silvery colors, almost white looking. They're much heavier fur, right? They look fluffier. And we think, of course, that's because they live far away from the equator where it's much colder. They have to blend into the coloration of the environment and so forth. But we don't necessarily see that for our own species. And one of those reasons why is because we travel a lot, right? Now, as a backwards look to something that's a completely different course, but we do want to remind you about it because you also in this unit are taking a look at the last steps of the evolution of the human brain. Most of our survival strategies are currently today cultural, and cultural means we use the biological capacity of our brain to look at things numerically, statistically, technically, our memory bank, which is very, very large, and other ways that our cognition connects things. And we use that to create what we call today technology. However, technology, be very clear, is information. So as we pass that information very specifically from generation to generation or from place to place or from person to person, we're able to remember how to solve survival situations, even if they don't occur very commonly. So sometimes this is called cultural and behavioral adjustments. Anthropology 102 takes a look at this in more detail. But for us today, we don't rely solely on what your body can do without using our cognition or our brain in order to remember that you might need a jacket or you need to carry water with you or oxygen is going to be an issue, all those sorts of things that you already know. So let's look at this more specifically and genetically then, polymorphisms. In your reading, polymorphisms are defined really specifically in terms of a ratio on page 114. Please don't miss that part of the reading. Make sure it's in your notes and you have that jotted down so that you can use that for answering questions towards the end of this unit. Now, polymorphisms, poly means many, and morph just means sort of body types or phenotypes, and they do appear in various species all over the planet, but not all species, not all types of species are polymorphic. So we're going to see polymorphic species in those that are generalized, where they have moved to a lot of different environments and where the different characteristics of those natural environments have shaped them. Shape sometimes is part of it, but it could be coloration, it could be digestion, it could be behavioral issues, body size, so forth, slightly differently so that they can do very well where they are currently living. Remember, natural selection is your current natural environment. So human populations now and for a very long time have also shown differences in physiologically or phenotypic traits too. Phenotype, remember, phenotype is the outcome of your genetic combinations. And this is the heart and soul of what we think of as polymorphisms. Production of variation in function or appearance. But here's the big difference, not just variations. All the variants are normal. So normal in biology is not the same thing as you think of as normal in your daily life. For us, socially or culturally, normal is generally in the society that you live in today expressed as what is the most common thing that you're going to see, or the most common way that people act, or the most common way that they make choices or conduct themselves. Biologically speaking, normal means something that is much more closely related to statistics. And I know lots of you are either going to have to take a stats class to graduate or have already done so. And good for you. Stats is really important in the modern world. Okay, so if something is statistically normal for a species, that means that we expect to see that variation commonly, and B, that common variation gives normal expectation of function and lifespan to that individual within the species. So it does not mean that it's the most common variation. It doesn't even mean that it's going to necessarily make each individual within a species be highly motivated for something like reproduction. But it does mean that we know that it is a typical variant in the species. So for instance, with humans, and this would be something to look at in more detail in a different type of course that would be more for majors or upper division, humans come in 5 biological sexes. You might not have been raised that way. You might not be socially interacting with a population that sees this as the way our species does exist, particularly because nowadays we wear clothes in public, and so we don't see any variations. And not all of it is external. It might be things that are internal, but at greater than 1% of human population all over the planet, we do have a large percentage of humans that are not simply bio-male or simply bio-female, but have a combination of other characteristics. Whether or not they are motivated to reproduce also is considered normal for a species like ours, right? 1, we're vastly overpopulated, and 2, we are basically, without being too technical here, a herd species, right? We are a species where the total group hangs out together all the time. And so it is not expected or needed that all of us are highly motivated to biologically reproduce. When we study other species, we see in other herd type species that also highly recognize dominance within the group, that the majority of biomales never pass on any sperm to the future. So one thing to take away just socially, we got to stop bullying people who are not highly motivated to be bio-parents. They still have a place in our species, and that is considered biologically normal. If we were a solitary species, that would be a different question, but we are not a solitary species. All right, so a polymorphism, as you're looking at in the chapter, is going to be where we have functions or appearances that give an expected lifespan, a typical way for that individual to survive. So we can look at the definition of this several ways, and I'm just going to put a couple up here, and the 2 also work the same. However, you might remember Unit 2 a little bit differently. So a polymorphism is when we see within one species variations in phenotypes that are the results of genetic variation, or even more easily for all of us as a group, the presence of having several distinct alleles for a single gene or phenotypic trait. In other words, like an allele for blue eyes versus green eyes, or an allele for being very tall versus not so tall, so on and so forth. And remember again, none of the variation is always superior to the other variation. They're all going to give you a normal functionality for life and lifespan. However, which variant works the best depends on where you are. Like high pigmentation in the skin, very, very positive variation for humans. If you're near the equator, in an open environment with very little shade. However, that variant isn't always superior to lack of skin pigmentation for populations that live in extremely shady environments with very, very low UV. Depigmentation helps better in that second option. So the big question for the balance of your chapter is, can we determine if human polymorphisms are the results of natural selection? And therefore, the variety means that some of your ancestors have had advantages with those genetic combinations in their original or specific environments. And the answer to sometimes we can tell. All right, so two good examples that you have in lots of detail, and I'm not going to spend tons of time narrating this part because you do have the Nina Jablonski video or other reading lesson that you can do, and it was also presented in the EVE program. But I do want to say right here, be sure that you are collecting the vocabulary here. Melanin, melanocytes, folic acid, and vitamin D, and its relationship to rickets. All of these things here are going to have something to do with whether or not we can tell that variation of skin pigmentation has something to do with natural selection. So firstly, you haven't in course heard me use the term color, and that's because human skin does not come in a variety of colors. It comes in different levels of melanin. So melanin is a biomolecule that produces pigment, so melanin. The type of cells that produce melanin are called melanocytes. Whether your complexion is very, very lightly complected or pigmented or moderate or deeply pigmented, it's all melanin. Melanin does have two slightly different forms, and the human eye sees pheomelanin as being more to what we would consider a reddish to yellowish tone. And again, this is in the human eye. Other species, their eyes picked up different wavelengths in a different way. And eumelanin, which is going to produce the deeper value of skin pigmentation that we see with human eyes. However, it's still basically melanin. Now, if you have none of it, then that is a genetic disorder. And that means that your system is not making melanin out of those melanocytes. So it is true that some babies are born without the light switch turned on. It just doesn't turn on the production of melanin. So we don't come in different colors, we just come in different strengths or complexities of melanin. And it isn't just on or off within those groups, right? We are sort of in a general tonal progression. People with more lightly complexioned skin, mainly going to produce more pheomelanin. Those with deeply complexioned skin or darkly pigmented skin, you can use the term socially colored. That's what most of us do. I just don't personally prefer that. I think it feeds in too much into our racial stereotypes, but that's me. And other people may use it differently. So mostly eumelanin for deep. All right, so level of skin pigmentation is responsive to the level of UV radiation. And as you have been reading about and you already knew, UV radiation is at its highest level at the equator. And where do humans originally come from? The equator, right? Our very first anatomically modern Homo sapiens population is coming from Africa. Earliest in finds that we have are in North Africa, but equally just about as old as Central Africa. So that very deeply pigmented level of skin pigmentation is the original level of skin pigment. Whether or not anyone you know is comfortable with that, it doesn't change science and nature. Originally, humans were all very deeply pigmented. Then, as you were looking at in the previous section of this unit, as some of those populations left Africa, whether they were going directly into the Arabian continent and over into Southeast Asia, or coming up around the equator, through the Mediterranean and into originally the Middle East and into what we call Europe today, doesn't make any difference. They all started out with deeply pigmented skin and depigmented over time later on. So as a reminder for you in class, and this is one of those ideas that people typically have before they start class that's really hard to give up, because for almost 20 years or more, you have thought it related to something else. Skin pigmentation does have something to do with natural selection, but remember, natural selection is only going to be very, very related to reproduction right here, reproduction. It does not have anything to do with conditions that happen later on in life, such as diseases like maybe cancer or something else that is going to be something that comes on later. So it is not going to play a role in skin pigmentation. So the high levels of UV radiation that originally formed our very deeply pigmented skin in Africa did interfere with something that did interfere with pregnancy, and that is the production of folate or folic acid. So originally, females needed high levels of skin pigmentation in order to be able to successfully reproduce. Males didn't really need it, right? Maybe they were going to get skin cancer later on in life, but they would have had at least a decade or 2 decades in order to pass on those gametes. But why did males end up with deeply pigmented skin? Because they are the children of the genetic donors, the moms, who had to have the deeply pigmented skin. Nina Jablonski talks about folic acid in the Skin Deep lessons in Canvas, so no problem with you being able to keep on going with that. So a couple more ideas here. Depigmentation. Why would depigmentation be a positive for reproduction in some places in the world? Because if you already have not so much UV, then you wouldn't need as much pigment in order to protect your levels of folic acid. So as she mentions in the lesson that you've already gone through, we will depigment very strongly or noticeably in certain environmental conditions. Full depigmentation of an entire population down to very lightly pigmented skin, maybe as much as 20,000 years in that environment. So it is possible that lightly pigmented skin has an advantage in allowing the body to produce vitamin D. Vitamin D used to be able to be called, and everybody knew it, but not so much anymore, the sunshine vitamin. Your body does not make vitamin D on its own. It has to have UV radiation in order to make that, and it requires for that UV not to just be on the back of your hands or a little bit of a minute of time on your face. And since so many of us, over 50% of the world's population today, live in cities and work indoors, it is a very, very common issue, particularly in the United States, with vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D deficiency causes problems in infants and in young children. So if your body is also already making it so that you're not getting much vitamin D from UV radiation, then they're going to be a little bit less likely to have super strong, healthy reproduction over time. Right. Body build and temperature, real quickly here. It's also in your textbook. Body build, which we can really see also in other mammals, influences heat retention or loss. So we see more linear builds in certain places of the world. One that's real easy to see in a real quick illustration would be here images of nilotic populations of sub-Saharan Africa. This is an area with almost no tree shade, very, very sunny, and one of the most common economies for the last 10,000 years is herding animals, which need to be out in the open. So instead of using vocabulary for linear build, we're just going to use linear. Cold climates, stocky, heat-retaining build. We do see both of these in modern sports, for instance. And I'm crushed, like many of you, that we aren't going to see more often these types of international events for athletes coming from all over the place, but you probably have it in your memory banks. For instance, or for instance, in something like boxing. Limb length, right, fingertip length makes a difference, and they really tell you people's stats for that if they're going to be punching each other, because if you have longer arms, you're going to be able to hit someone without them being able to reach you quite as easily. Longer fingertip length is really something that we see much more commonly in people whose recent ancestors within the last not too long are coming from hotter, drier climates. Shorter, stockier populations are those that we see frequently in some types of other sporting kinds of things. So you're seeing leggier, more linear, longer legs, longer fingertip in some of our modern sports where people run, 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 run. Doesn't mean they're 6.5 feet tall, but so for long distance running, why? Because their body is better at keeping them a little bit cooler so that they don't overheat too fast, and they're able to do things like um, uh, the really, really long distance outdoor running. Um, well, and even the taller populations like basketball and so forth. So for marathoners, yep, you see a lot of them come from certain parts of the world, and they just have that tiny little edge. For stockier or heat retaining builds, that sometimes we're going to see that a little bit more in powerlifting and so forth. We'll also see the outside of this, those of you that follow Southeast Asian martial arts, you've probably seen how the athletes, they look fit, but they don't look like they have gargantuan muscles, like maybe a more stereotypical action movie kind of star that we see in US and Europe. However, if you've ever seen them hit or kick on a wrapped pole or target, they have as much muscle strength as somebody who looks like their muscles are much, much bigger. So these slight differences, right? Southeast Asia is going to be a more slender heat losing build because it is very hot and very humid, and it's really hard to cool down. So we can see this really in modern humans as well in lots of ways that we're still. So in this particular image here, this particular specific group, you can see starting at the left here, this young woman, she looks very, very slender because she has an outdoor life. She herds animals for a living, and you can see how long and slender she is in the fingertips, long and slender she is in the arms. However, no doubt about it, she is much, much stronger than you and I might guess. One of her jobs is to collect multiple times per day giant buckets full, or if it isn't a bucket, it's a big leather skin bag full of water, and carry it quite a long distance over to where her family or her husband's herds are to water goat, camel, and other animals that they might be watering, and then she'll walk all the way back and carry that. Super strong, just not bunchy looking muscles. In the center and right hand views, these are younger bio males who are actually at the man fair. The man fair is something that this particular group has done traditionally. They are allowed to have multiple wives, one or more, should they be looking for that, but the women choose. So the males come and doll themselves up, kind of like a beauty pageant, and they are displaying the health of their white teeth and how fit they are, how tall they are, and so forth. And the women walk along the row and select. And if you go home together, you're married. The women can leave them fairly anytime they really want. If they have kids, though, the kids have to stay with the biological father. So generally, once they have had children, the wives will stay as much as as long as they can, or as much as possible. So in this particular case, you can see that they are not real broad in the shoulders compared to how big around they are in the rib cage. But so this is a linear build, a heat losing build, because they spend a lot of time in lots of heat. Now, for every polymorphism that we can find in humans, are all of them adaptively significant? And the answer is, as you might have guessed, we don't know for sure because we haven't tried to study all of them. The other issue seems to be, in some cases, that humans in the last several centuries or several thousand years have migrated so often and have then done, remember gene flow with other populations where they've merged, that we can't always tell where originally those particular polymorphisms may have come from or when that population got there. Modern DNA testing, especially the ancestry ones, as more and more people on the planet give a DNA sample and add to that planetary database, might clear. So here's an example of a really good one that's well studied, and this is going to feed into our discussion of your immune system and infectious disease, is the ABO blood type system. Now, human blood comes in a lot of different variations. ABO is only one of them. There's another one that you're pretty familiar with as well, the one that is termed RH, which is your positive or negative one. So there are many, many different tests that we can do from human blood, and ABO is just one of them. Now, nowadays, ABO blood type groups are not clearly linked to any one particular spot on the planet. However, we have enough data now, genetically and from some other ways of collecting this type of data, to determine that originally that there were dominant places on the planet where we would see one of these blood type systems much more common than the other. Currently, right now, type O blood is the most common blood protein on the planet. A comes next, and B is the least common. All of the over 20 different blood protein groups, systems on the planet, are considered polymorphisms. All right, vocabulary you need right here. Antigen. Antigen is another term for a protein. Remember, genetic combinations make a protein. So antigens are the proteins which are going to be the recipe or the outcome for your blood cells. Now, one of the things I might have put in here, specific proteins located on the surface of the red blood cells might be located on the surface of your red blood cells. It depends on your blood type. Not everybody has an extra antigen on the surface of your red blood cells. And then the other term, antibodies, in the news constantly. It doesn't matter the year, it doesn't matter what our health concerns are. Antibodies are something we're always thinking about. Antibodies are things that your own system also produces. So if they're produced, they're another form of protein. These proteins are really your bouncers or your security guards in your system. Antibodies are their own group of proteins. They should recognize your own antigens, right? They should recognize proteins that are supposed to be there. Therefore, when an antibody comes across a species or a substance of a protein that is not local or known to your body, it goes over and grabs a hold of it and escorts it away. So they are reactionary. So the job of antibodies, like in everyday English, a bouncer or a security guard, is to defend you against organisms that are foreign species, and they determine that by the protein. So they are their own form of protein, and in order to protect you, it has to be able to bind shape-wise very specifically to the target. And therefore, when your body makes antibodies, because you've been exposed to something like let's say herpes, those antibodies, they don't have a blueprint for other kinds of diseases. So all they're doing is looking for herpes. They can't actually protect you against something else that comes in later. Your body has to make new ones with that particular work order for the new infection. So that's invertebrates. This is their primary way that the body defends against infection. What happens is, since antibodies need to have a, let's say, a picture, right? They need to have a very specific target that they're looking for. It means that your individual system, or any animal, can make billions of different antibody molecules. And it's going to have to be in the right shape. It's got a lock and key relationship. So each antibody has to recognize its target with great specificity. This is the problem that happens when a species, especially a microorganism, evolves and in a new specific form that your body hasn't seen before. Your body hasn't made any antibodies that recognize that, and it doesn't initially know how to make those antibodies that's really going to manage that new antigen with great specificity. All right, so when you get a blood type test, what are they doing? They are looking for an antibody-antigen reaction. They take a drop of blood, put it on the slide, put another drop of an agent on there, and see if your body reacts. If your body reacts, then it means that to what they added, then it means that what they added is not you. If your body doesn't react, then it means that that protein is considered friendly or typical. Let's look at the chart here for a second. Now, with these particular levels here. So the term blood type up here, that's going to be down this way. Antigen across here, these, antibody this way. All right, so if you get a result and it says your blood type is A, it means that you have an extra protein on the surface of your red blood cells, and that antigen is typed as A antigen here. It means your body hates B. So if even a small little bit of B type blood gets in your system is highly reacting to it. It starts attacking that blood, and this can be fatal with a very, very tiny amount. So A-type blood means that the protein you have is A. If your blood type is B, then your body made that protein called B. And so you have the B antigen. That's normal for you. It also means that your body hates A. So in both of these cases, A and B, on the surface of your red blood cell, it put an extra protein coat. A has the extra A coat, B has the extra B coat. If you have codominance, one of your parents gave you the A allele gene and the other gave you the B, then it means you've got two coats over the surface. You've got both A and B. So both A and B, so you are codominant. In this case, your immune system likes A and B because both of them are you. So you don't have any antibodies that are going to react to that. What is the plus to having AB type blood? The plus is that you are the universal receiver. You can take A or B, so you are the universal receiver. What's the minus? AB blood donors are not quite as common, so it's a good thing you can take blood from anybody else because you don't have to have it be exactly A and B. Now, for the last one, blood type O. With blood type O, you do not have any extra antigen on the surface of your blood cells. So it's just the red blood cell itself. Therefore, there's no extra protein on the outside. That lack of an extra protein means that AB and AB people can receive type O blood because it's not irritating, right? You don't have an extra antigen, so you can't be against something that doesn't exist in science. In your personality, yeah, maybe. Okay, but here's the reason why, the other reason why type O blood people are basically hunted down by the blood bank. Their own system will not accept A or B. It will not accept A or B. So while O is the most common blood type on the planet, it cannot take anything other than B. But everyone else, especially if it's a fast emergency and you haven't been typed, can take type O blood until they figure out what specifically to give you. So we need more O because there are more O people, and we need more O because O can donate to anyone. So O is the universal donor. AB, the universal receiver. Can type A take O? Yes. Can type B take O? Yes. Can type AB take O? Yes. All right, so that's just a practical little part of all of this, right? So what does this have to do with wrapping up this portion of your reading and thinking about diseases and looking at what things are still shaping our species? With disease resistance or receptibility and looking at blood type, not because the ABO blood type system is not about heat, it's not about altitude, it's not about diet, it's not about temperature, it's not about oxygen concentration, it is about microorganisms and the incidence of disease in the past. So if antibodies are something that your body's making, and it's how you fight off diseases. If a microorganism evolves and accidentally gets a mutation that makes a protein, remember antigen is a form of protein, that's similar to, let's say, the A or B extra coating on your red blood cells, it's possible that certain blood types are not going to recognize that particular antibody as easily as maybe because your body isn't recognizing it. It's like that organism has a disguise. They might be dressed up in something that the body doesn't immediately recognize as a problem. If that happens, then the organism that's causing damage to your system is in there longer and is going to be able to produce more damage. And therefore, once your body starts making your antibodies, your security guards, your bouncers, right, then it will already be in more cells or have damaged more cells over time. Now, the outcome of this, though, to remember is that no one blood type recognizes everything perfectly, rapidly, or is dominant in every case in terms of disease or infection. Some are better with some diseases, slightly. This is slightly. They don't give you death necessarily immediately, but you might have more problems recovering, and that might be something that over time, especially if it is making a slightly higher percentage of children or young adults not survive the infection, make it so that in an area, a particular blood type becomes less common or